Richard, you've touched on this earlier in the conversation, which is the fact that folks have a lot more choices now, right? They can look at work-life balance. They can look at where they're going. They can consider all of those things as they're looking at their next position, potentially wherever they may go. And 80% of data shows that organizations are experiencing sustained or rising executive turnover, and more than a third of leaders are considering that are considering exiting would prefer to leave within a year. So that's a very, very tight time frame. Richard, where are you seeing the most vulnerability right now, and what are sort of the downstream impacts of this when specifically we're seeing this leadership change get unaddressed by leaders?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot of factors that go into it. The ones you mentioned, certainly. The fact that Betty talked about CEO turnover. We've just gone through a CEO search and new CEO. And when a new CEO comes in, there's going to be change. There's going to be change in personnel and change in process. So I think that adds to that instability. And then the last thing we talked about, which was people often have more than one job now. So you may have somebody who has 2 or 3 jobs. If that person exits, 10, 15 years ago, you would gather the other folks in that area around, and they would be able to make up that time while you found a new person if you didn't have one internally. Now you don't have that luxury. You can't have that role empty and have multiple leadership positions unfilled. So it just puts a lot of pressure on these folks who are leaving. I can speak for the 3 organizations I've been in the last 25 years. They all thought they had good succession plans, but they don't always work. And so I would love to tell you we have an ironclad succession plan, but it doesn't always work that way. Either people are having another child, or one of their children are going off to college, or their spouse is retiring, and all those things come into play when someone leaves, and now you've got a hole, now you've got a gap, and you thought you had somebody internally, and it doesn't always work out. So I'm very concerned by those statistics, that you could lose a third of your leadership in 2 or 3 years by turnover. That's very concerning, especially when you try and go out and recruit those folks. So we are certainly, where I am, working to have a succession plan, but I don't put all my eggs in that basket.
Yeah. Again, it adds to we talked about the complexity of it, and we talked about the technical complexity, but this also adds the human component to this conversation, which is often so incredibly hard to predict on what's going to happen next. I love that all of the factors that you've mentioned there. Rob, I'd love to come to you here too. Again, what are you seeing there in terms of vulnerability, right? Where is the most vulnerability when it comes to the succession planning that we've just touched on? And again, what is the danger of leaving this unaddressed from an organizational perspective?
Yeah, great question, Lucas. What I see right now from a position standpoint, we're seeing a lot across the C-suite continuum. More recently, CEOs, CFOs, and CHROs. We're seeing a lot that's happening there in that space by way of turnover, which when I put my CHRO cap on, it causes me to question, what is happening here? Is it systemic? Is there something there? Is that a symptom of something that the organization can control? Is it something that maybe they can't control? Is it a combination of both things there? So, I do think that succession planning is very, very important. And succession planning can lead bidirectionally. It can, once you've established and scoped out what you want and the vision for the position moving forward, it could lead you very, directly to someone internal that you develop. But it also could lead to, hey, listen, we understand we have a gap here, and we need to begin thinking about what that talent pool looks like externally as well, with someone that aligns with our vision, that brings integrity to the position, that will deliver for us in a way that augments and supports our culture moving forward. So a lot that's happening in that space. And And then, I would say also too, one of the, I think, risks that if you don't address this and you don't have a plan to quickly transition, or as quickly as possible, that can impact your brand, right? So that can begin to impact your brand. It can impact culture, the way you're perceived by the community, the way you're perceived by your internal team members as well. So a lot of ramifications for not having succession planning in place, but understanding the holistic nature of succession planning and not just the myopic, hey, it's got to be someone every single time from the inside.
Betty, I know you were having these conversations all the time and with a lot of leaders across the country. First off, just really quickly, are people aware of this? Are people aware that this creates tremendous vulnerability? Are they talking about it? And then just from your perspective too, again, what happens when this is not addressed, when they're not having a conversation with you about it?
Yeah, I would say people are aware, but I think also it comes down to prioritization. I think organizations should really treat leadership stability as a strategic asset and go about it with the same rigor as you do the finances and the budget and the strategic plan. It should be a lot more talked about and thought, deeply. And if it's not, I think to Rob's point, culture erosion becomes a major risk. I think teams begin to struggle with uncertainty when leadership messaging and the direction is repeatedly changed. Operational consistency suffers. Each new leader that comes in brings in a different operating philosophy, which can slow execution on the longer term strategic plan. I think physician relationships can be particularly vulnerable with constant leadership change, and just trust in general across the organization weakens if it goes unaddressed.
I like to call these creeping metrics. They're not metrics that are appearing in hard red numbers. They're sort of creeping across the screen a little bit, and they hit you all at once at some point. Mike, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, in terms of how you're seeing this develop when it comes to vulnerability. And again, from your perspective, if this goes unaddressed, what happens?
Well, I agree 100% of what Rob and Betty have outlined, and that is, we're culture is super important. If you're on a good trajectory, and if you're on a pathway, and you have a lot of leadership instability, that derails that pathway pretty fast. And who suffers? Patients suffer, because ultimately it'll get to the bedside. And for all the reasons that have been outlined earlier, from a physician relationship perspective and stability there, because I think physicians and physician leaders, if you have rotation, say of operational leaders or nursing leaders, get a little bit, jaded in terms of, okay, who's going to be next and how long are they going to be here for? And so that's why I think this strategic imperative of leadership stability, leadership cultivation, talent management becomes very, very important. And I do agree too, it's a combination of what we can develop from within, as well as bringing in expertise from abroad, but you got to balance that really carefully, because you don't want to derail your culture if your culture's good. I think if your culture isn't good, it's maybe time to look outside. But it gets back to what people were citing earlier too. If you've got strong support from your board and the direction from the board, you want to make sure you're maintaining that stability, maintaining that those areas that you really want to develop the succession planning from. But and that takes a lot of partnership internally and a lot of investment internally of what you're doing with your succession planning. And it does take an investment, but if you look at how much it costs to bring somebody in constantly, I think it's well worth the investment.